So, welcome, good afternoon, and welcome to Siggraph. I'm Bernhard Riecke. I'm here from Simon Fraser University, just around the corner, here also in Vancouver. And I'm quite excited to talk today about what I believe is one of the most persistent and critical challenges really in the realms of XR and virtual reality or VR. That's really, how can we design VR that doesn't make us sick? So really better understanding and mitigating cybersickness. And I'd like to thank my wonderful co-author, Bernhard, who was deeply involved in the early preparations of this course, but unfortunately can't be here with us today. So I'll just be presenting alone here. So the goal here is really to provide you and all the content creators, researchers, developers, wherever you see yourself, with a structured science-based framework, really, that kind of encapsulates and integrates many of the existing theories. And so we go more from the basics to the applied parts in terms of how to really make this work. Just to get it out of the way, you're more than welcome to take pictures, but I'm also going to provide the slides at the end of it. There will be a QR code, so you don't have to take pictures. So why are we all here? Why do so many of us dedicate almost decades of our lives really to try and make virtual reality work? And it's really, for many of us, it comes back to the idea, this promise of an oasis, as you call it in Ready Player One. Basically this wonderful, amazing virtual environment that gives you the ability to connect, to create, to experience things you might otherwise not be able to experience. So really empowering you and doing the kind of things you can't do in the real world. And this is a wonderful, beautiful idea, as we've seen in some science fiction, not in others. But of course, there's a problem, and that is cybersickness. It's kind of like the nemesis of it. Have you ever seen anybody basically getting so sick that they were like, I'll never put on a headset again. I don't want to have anything to do with VR. So, and this can really prevent the success of the whole industry. And no matter how beautiful the applications are, if people get sick, they won't come back. So the stakes are really high there. So it's really about fulfilling this full potential of the entire industry. And this isn't just an anecdotal problem. The data is pretty clear. Almost everybody is susceptible to motion sickness. And there's a variety of different symptoms. The most common ones are nausea, but there's a lot more. There's also disorientation, oculomotor disturbances like eye challenges, even Sopite syndrome like excessive sleepiness, fatigue, apathy, and so on. And this range of susceptibility also tells a story about how immensely variable and complex that problem is. So how do we really get from this swamp of bad user experience that many of us have probably experienced to really the somewhat of more comfortable experience? And that's kind of our journey here, and we'll really structure this presentation as this metaphorical journal to get out of this swamp to this by a structured framework that I present here for the first time actually ever, so I'm quite excited, a little bit nervous. The way I structure this talk is to really start with the problem. What is cybersickness? Why do people get sick? That's module one. Then how to measure cybersickness in the next module. Then I'll talk a lot more about the framework, the VR comfort stack, and shared responsibility in the third module. And I'll weave in solutions into module 3 and the final module 4, where we kind of walk up the pyramid together and provide actionable guidelines. And in a nutshell, my thesis here is really that to truly tackle cybersickness, we must go beyond seeing it as a simple sensory conflict and really understand it as a more systemic prediction error problem, which is what the VR comfort stack really provides a blueprint to solve. So before anything further, let's get a sense of where the room is here. Who has actually tried virtual reality? Ooh, almost everybody. Has anybody not tried it? It's okay. Cool. All right. So who has actually ever felt cybersickness? Okay. Keep your arms up if you had to stop the experience because of that. Whoa. Okay. Quite a few people. I certainly had to do this, especially when I'm teaching VR classes. Thanks. Can take your arm down. Where I often tell people, well, if you make my TA sick, that's not good for your grade. So it is a really critical issue. Okay, no, we've seen the numbers, it's a lot. Let's hear some of the stories. So, as just a little bit of an icebreaker, I call it the Worst Cybersickness Story Swap. So basically, turn to your next neighbor and take a minute to really share your most memorable or horrifying, scary cybersickness story. That could be yours or something you witnessed. Make sure to introduce yourself. I'll take a minute, so actually do talk. All right. So thanks a lot for sharing your stories. Thank you. So it's very clear that a lot of you have stories. I initially was thinking we would have a Discord channel to share this, but it turns out Siggraph this year doesn't have a Discord channel. So hopefully you heard some interesting stories there. So really to understand why behind these stories, we need to dive a bit more into the first module, which is really about the why behind motion sickness. So what are some of the fundamental theories and ideas? So really understanding this foundation is crucial for really being able to build up and come with solutions. So let's start with the most basic question. What actually is cybersickness? How does it actually feel like? And it's actually a lot broader than just nausea. So nausea is part of these gastrointestinal issues, but there's also stomach awareness symptoms, burping, general discomfort, vomiting, although it doesn't happen very often. There's a lot of oculomotor issues relating from eye strain, difficulty focusing, blurred vision, headaches, fullness of head. And while I go through this list, you can check yourself, like, okay, which ones have you actually experienced yourself? There's whole kinds of orientation issues ranging from disorientation, dizziness, vertigo, fullness of head. And then you might have seen people actually go pale or be cold but still sweaty. It's kind of an unusual situation there, but it does happen quite frequently. And then there's the arousal symptoms, and often a bit overlooked, the Sopite syndrome. So it's really the difficulty concentrating, drowsiness, fatigue, apathy, these kind of things. And finally, there might be additional things like readaptation. How do you go back from virtual reality to reality? There might be reality confusion, feeling annoyed, irritated, there's reduced performance. By the way, you're welcome to take pictures. You don't have to. I'll share a link to the whole slide deck in the end. But you're more than welcome to take pictures, of course. So what that means, if you're completely drained for the rest of the day, that might literally be part of what cybersickness adverse symptoms really happen to you. Another critical thing is to see that cybersickness is really just a simple on-off switch. It's really more of a gradual attack. So it really can creep up on you. So here's an example where you see individual lines and then two summary lines basically showing some lucky people. For them, it stays at a very low level. For others, it goes up until they kind of tap out and often have to stop the experience. Here's another example from a VR sickness benchmark where it was a really intense roller coaster. So within just a few minutes, sometimes even within 1 or 2 minutes, people got so sick that they basically had to stop. But when they stopped, then we kept measuring their cybersickness, asking them to rate it. And what you can see is also it can go down quite quickly in this VR sickness. However, in some other examples, like the one mentioned here, cybersickness can really last for several hours, even half a day or more sometimes. If you look at the averages, so there's some lucky people who don't really get sick. They don't report feeling sick. If you still give them the scale, they maybe rate very low, like in the 5 to 10% range. Whereas for other people, it really keeps going up over time. And many of the details really depend a lot on all the participant simulation parameters, and we'll go a lot more into this part. So we talked about the symptoms, we talked about the time course. What is cybersickness really, and how does it really relate to other forms of motion sickness? So to do this, I'll have a diagram where we have the different input modalities on one axis and the kind of applications on the other axis. And motion sickness is kind of this overarching big blobs, these big pictures. And there's specific types of sickness. For example, vestibularly induced motion sickness. If you close your eyes on a merry-go-round or in a roller coaster, you can still get sick. For auditory cues, it's less often, but we literally had participants, eyes closed, listening to rotating sound sources. Within a minute, they went pale, and we really had to stop the simulation. More common are visually induced sickness in general, and specifically visually induced motion sickness. And all of you probably know motion sickness in all kinds of vehicles. Could be in planes, in cars, in ships. There's even a thing called camel sickness. There's also cinerama sickness, there's gaming sickness that tends to include a bit more additional cue simulator sickness. Here we talk a lot about cyber sickness or VR sickness. And this really relates a lot to, or is most commonly induced by visual vestibular conflict in VR. So what do we mean by that? So basically that sickness tends to arise when the perceived self-motion or action is really unpredictable, uncontrollable, or creates a profound mismatch with any of the other senses, and also with your brain's internal prediction of what you should experience. What does that mean? If I rotate my head here, or if I step to the side, the world is stable. Nice. That's good. We're used to that. That is very deeply ingrained in our system. There's even a vestibular ocular reflex. I move my head, my eyes automatically counter-rotate, even in darkness. Now, if the virtual scene doesn't keep up with that, if there's any delay, stutter, tracking issues, and so on, that really is a huge issue. So basically, there's this challenge of the VR really keeping up with what a stable world would look like. Now, on the positive side, cybersickness is really based on what users perceive in VR. And that means is you actually have control. This is about what you show to them, what they listen to, if you have a motion platform, what that does. But it's also our responsibility. Now, this brings us to this takeaway, basically. The solution is in our hands, but how do we actually do this? So let's go a bit more deeply into some of the core theories here. The most common one is the sensory conflict theory here. Also one of the older ones. So the idea is really here when the visual, vestibular, proprioceptive, and other system cues really receive conflicting signals that are not in accordance with the movement predictions of our own internal system, for example, movement, then discomfort and motion sickness can arise. So in a way, you can think of that as, okay, I'm, let's say, in a car simulation, a train simulation, and there might be a lot of visual cues. You get a strong sensation of self-motion. Great, that's what the visual system tells you. On the other hand, the vestibular system tells you, well, there was no cue. There's definitely nothing happening here, no acceleration, no deceleration. Huge conflict. And this is basically what this theory is about. This has been later refined a bit as the what's called the neural mismatch hypothesis. So the conflict is not just between the concurrent senses, but between concurrent sensor inputs and the brain's stored expectation or prediction or internal model based on our lifetime of experience. Now, what happens if there's a conflict like this? Then your system might tell you like, oh shit, I'm seeing this kind of movement stimulus. It looks like I'm swaying and so on. And back in the old days before we had screens, that was typically a signal that you ate something, inhaled, ingested something that probably wasn't that good for you. So it might ask you to get rid of that. And that's called the poison theory in essence. So basically it's the brain's defensive mechanism of really dealing with neurotoxins before it gets too bad. So the sensory conflict. A second complementary theory is the postural instability theory. So the idea is really there that sickness arises from a prolonged loss of the ability to automatically control one's posture and balance when adapting, especially to something novel like a virtual environment. So sickness is really a breakdown of our brain's automatic pilot for balance. And the important thing here is that this measurable physical inability happens before you consciously feel sick. So in a way, if you feel sick in there, that's not just a symptom, but could also be a cause, not just a side effect, but really contributing or exacerbating motion sickness, as illustrated here. Now, building on these ideas, a more refined perspective is this of the unexpected action or predictability hypothesis. This is a bit similar to the classic passenger with a driver idea. As a driver, you know what's going on, you can predict what's going on, you're much less likely to drive, even though when you're a passenger and the driver then is actually doing a really smooth ride, because you cannot predict, you cannot expect it, this contributes to motion sickness. So it's really the predictability that is important. So their important conclusions, of course, will give users an agency over that. And especially try to avoid unsolicited camera visual movements. So basically, if the whole world suddenly changes, not so good. Now, finally, there's another theory that's often a bit overlooked, but I think it's really important. It's called the rest frame hypothesis, or stable world hypothesis by Prothero and others. So there, the idea is really that VR sickness is not caused by a sensory conflict directly, but it's also a cognitive one. So basically, your brain is constantly trying to figure out, okay, what part of the scene is actually stationary? Can I trust this to be stable? So this is one reason when in your ship, you actually want to look outside. Who's ever got sick on a ship? For whom of those did it happen when you were underboard and did not see outside? Probably quite a few, yeah. And this totally makes sense. Because when you're in there, in the cabin, and the only visual cues you have are stable. So it suggests a stable world. You typically the proprioceptive system tells you otherwise. That really messes up with your internal predictive system. The same thing can happen in virtual reality. If you forget to have a stable horizon, or the stable horizon really doesn't align with your vestibular cues because you're moving way too fast and have too many jerks in there, that really can create a problem there. So what do you do? Basically, what's perceived as a world or background or rest frame should really be perceived as stable. So really try to provide an unambiguous background or rest frame that's world stable and really matches the vestibular cues, and very less about the object motions. Now, we've seen some of the different theories. There's a few more, but they're all filtered through maybe one of the most important and variable factor at all, and this is individual differences. We know they can have a huge impact. So can we predict who's more likely to get sick? Many of you might have heard that traditional females seem to get more easily sick in VR than males. Later research suggests that, well, maybe that's actually a technical issue because the headsets are typically adjusted to the males' interpupillar distance, or some of the older headsets actually don't even allow you to reduce the interpupillar distance or IPD to so it matches everybody in there. There's also a complex relationship with age and ethnicity and so on, but the data isn't super clear on that part. What is clear is that the susceptibility varies hugely between participants. So really you have to embrace that variability. What that also means, if you want to test any system, don't just test it on yourself and your hardcore VR gamer friends, or just on people who you know get motion sick very easily. Really you need a large variety of people. If you run research studies, then really try to do it within subject study, although that's a bit complicated if really people have lingering effects and they might not even want to come back. So a comfortable experience really is the one that really provides options and flexibility in there. Now, we don't have control over who's necessarily trying out your VR. What we do have immense control over is really the system and content factors, and we know that a lot of them contribute to cybersickness. Maybe what most well known is the field of view under which you see things. So very clearly, the larger your field of view, the more easily you get a sensation of actually moving through space. That's also called vection. And that is, in a way, a necessary prerequisite for motion sickness. It's kind of similar to, well, okay, if you're sitting in a car, the car's not moving, you don't get motion sick. In VR, if you don't really feel like you're moving, then that doesn't make you sick. Conversely, if you get strong vection, strong sensation of self-motion, that alone doesn't make you sick. It's not like you driving in a car makes you sick, it's how you drive. So basically the illusion of self-motion in that view is a necessary but not sufficient prerequisite for motion sickness. So basically, that's also one of the reasons, well, if you just have a small field of view on mobile device and you don't put it super close, it's really hard to get sick because you don't get the sense that you're actually moving. It just looks like object motion. And then there's, of course, many other factors, like a lot of setup factors that we will go into a bit more detail later on. And of course, where people have a lot of control is the content. So you can easily imagine if you have this rapid, harsh roller coaster ride, people are a lot more likely to get sick than a stationary user experience where they sit nicely in this calm, stationary environment without any huge visual changes. So we absolutely have control over this content. This is kind of one of the levers we can pull. All right, so let's try and connect all the theory back to the stories we shared earlier. So think about a time you felt sick in VR, maybe your cybersickness horror stories. Which of these explanation or theories really resonates most with your own experience? So again, let's just do simple hand raising so we don't need to take out our devices. So neural mismatch hypothesis. So for example, my senses reported something that violated my brain's fundamental expectation of how the world should work. Who's that? A few people? Yeah. And you can probably raise your arm several times. At least for me, that's the case. Next one would be postural stability theory. So loss of postural control. I lost my sense of automatic balance. I felt physically unsteady, started swaying, so I had to consciously work to be stable. Anybody there? A few? Good. And then next one is the unexpected action or predictability hypothesis. So really lack of agency. For example, if the roller camera moved in a way that I couldn't predict or control, violating my sense of agency. Anybody there? Oh, that's a lot. Okay, yeah. Good. And finally, the rest frame hypothesis or stable world hypothesis. So basically, lack of any stable anchor or rest frame. So for example, if there was no clear stable object or background, like a horizon, that you could really use to ground your perception. Anybody there? A few as well? Yeah, certainly had that literally in a ship simulator, ironically. What that tells us really, there's not a single cause. It's really a multifaceted problem that really demands a multi-layered solution. And this was one of the motivation, well, literally in preparing for this course, I developed the VR Comfort Stack idea to try and figure out how the different theories really come together. All right, so let's connect the stars back here. So this brings us really to the next part here. So we spent the first part understanding the why of cybersickness, but if you want to fix it, if you want to address it, really have to find a way to measure it. We can't really improve something if you can't quantify it. So how do we actually assess, measure motion sickness? So let's open up and look at this measurement toolkit. Probably the most common toolkit is really self-report. The gold standard here, and one of the oldest one, is the SSQ Simulator Sickness Questionnaire. Who has ever used it or applied it? So quite a few people here. It's great, has different subskills like nausea, oculomotor issues, disorientation subskills. There's of course other longer questionnaires like this, has 16 items. What that means is you can really only run it before and after, but not really during the experience. There's also faster motion sickness scales. One is literally called the fast motion sickness scale. It's just a single rating scale, can be very fast, low intrusion. It can even happen during the experience. Has anybody tried that out, used it? Also a few people, yeah. It's obvious it doesn't have the detail, but you can literally run it during the study. So you can ask people in between to just give one rating, either verbally or with a controller or something. Quite good. And there's of course many other scales out there. Now, however, if you really want to understand what's going on and really understand the user experience, the strategies it might have, what is going on, then it really helps to go into more depth. And this is where qualitative methods, combining them with quantitative, mixing them, can really help. And you might need to go to interviews. We did one really detailed study on that. There's a link to that also on the final slide, where we tried this. And it's quite impressive, all the different strategies you can find if you ask different experts. Now, so you can basically see the SSQ almost like a post-flight inspection tool, and the FMS as more of the quick, how are you feeling, check-in during the flight. Now, beyond what users tell us, you can also try to listen to what their bodies are telling us. They might not be even aware of that. So what do researchers look for there? There could be gastroactivity, heart, sweating, breathing, temperature, eye movements, all these kind of things. And what's the promise there? It's really to have some, ideally, objective, real-time data that you can analyze directly and do something about it. Well, in reality, it's a bit more complex. There's not a single silver bullet, really. Some of them are a bit more expensive. But this is really the research frontier, if you wish. Like, how do you really combine all these different measures and ideally automatically measure and align and so on? But keep in mind, sometimes it can also be a bit annoying, frustrating to put on all these electrodes, whatever you have to do. So I'd like to step a bit closer and give an overview of some of these measures. So I present a table here. I won't read the whole thing. It's way too dense. But I wanted you to have this in the course proceedings. So there's a few classic signals like sweating, heart rate, cortisol level, temperature, and breathing. And all of these are correlated to motion sickness, but there are many other reasons why you might sweat more and so on, or have an elevated heart rate, cortisol level. So they all are also similarly triggered by other things like excitement and stress and so on. There's one measure, gastric activity, that is actually tells you quite a bit about what your stomach is doing, so it really helps with assessing nausea, but you still have to attach electrodes. So it doesn't work in all the specific applied contexts. Now there's one set of measures that are increasingly easily available, and this is head movements and eye pupil tracking, because it's often built into the head-mounted displays, at least the higher-end models. So wouldn't it be great if you could use those? And indeed, they do correlate, especially pupil dilation and pupil tracking can correlate with motion sickness quite nicely. But in and by themselves, there's of course lots of sensor noise. There's a lot of other alternative possible explanations. So likely the future isn't one magic signal, but it's really the convergence and really combining multiple data streams and really using them in a smart way. Now, if you are giving a demo or running studies and so on, one of the most immediately useful toolkits for many of us is probably really just observational. So just what are users actually doing? How do they change? So users' discomfort often manifests in their actions, and sometimes even before they feel sick or before they notice it, that it's actually happening. So it's the observational toolkit. So it could be, for example, changes in posture and balance. So are users kind of stiffening up or trying to make a step to the side, trying to balance things, like, for example, if you have a shaky ground like I have here. This is one thing you can observe. Changes in physiology. Are they starting to sweat? Or do they turn pale? Are they slowing down? Do they make more errors? Are there any performance degradations, basically? And you could also have strategic avoidance. So do their movement strategies change? Do they stop looking around? Things like that. So in a way, you can use these as a checklist when you're running a demo here in the, at Siggraph or running a user study. And in a way, that is your responsibility to check, because often the users will not be aware that they are sick, especially if they want to power through and are so immersed. And often they only notice how sick they are after the experience is already over, when it's kind of too late, because then they often have serious side effects. Now, where's all of this heading there? I mean, the future is clearly to bring all these things together and really predict sickness, ideally before it gets bad, and then adapt VR in real time by, for example, adjusting the simulation, changing the different systems, switching to different comfort modes, and so on. What's the input there? Just about anything you can measure, really, that we talked about. What's the engine there? Well, any kind of statistical, computational, machine learning model. So I won't go into this. A lot of people are working in detail, and I think there's a few papers on this here also at Siggraph. So the holy grail, or one of the many holy grails, is really to create these bioadaptive VR. So an experience that really assesses and detects discomfort, and then ideally tries to automatically do something about it. Like, for example, blending in a comfort vignette before people really get sick. Now, let's look one example of this in action. This is from my colleague Bernhard, who can't be here, unfortunately. So it was a simple video of simulation in a European-style cobblestone, so lots of shakiness in there. What you see, first of all, there's a group of people here in green that, on average, didn't really get very sick, and that was remained stable. So slightly elevated, but really, really low. That's kind of the 5 to 10% range. However, the people who reported getting sick, it actually kept increasing until many of them actually tapped out. Now, the nice thing there is they also tracked physiological responses over time. And what they found is really a clear divergence in signals over time between the sick and the non-sick participants. So for example, their facial temperature, when people got sick, it tends to drop down, they moved more, the heart rate went up, heart rate variability also changed. So what does it show us really? That you can use each of these signals as an early warning system, but only if you start combining them in smart ways do they become more reliable. So now that we have a bit more of a robust toolkit for understanding and measuring the problem, we can try and finally turn to our heart to the next and the more practical matter, the solutions. So what do we actually do now? So this is the next module here, really. So we defined the problem, we looked at the theories, we opened up the measurement toolkit. Now let's get to the practical matter, really the practical things, solutions, what can we do about it? And this is where I introduced this comfort stack model that I talked about, which is a structured systemic framework. So as mentioned, I literally developed this in preparing for the Siggraph talk over the last many months, because it was just hard to convey all the different theories. So this is still a bit work in progress, so I'd love your thoughts and feedback. If you have any thoughts or if you see any flaws, please let me know. So here it is. So we basically framed it as this journey from the swamp of bad user experience to the summit of good user experience, obviously metaphorically speaking. But the idea is really, it's not just comfort and no motion sickness, but also high usability, present enjoyment, performance, all these kind of things. And it's a hierarchical model. So similar to Maslow's hierarchy, where each kind of layer depends on the next one, we have here multiple layers. I'll go through them in a moment. And the idea is that the stability of each layer depends on the strength of the layer below it, kind of like in architecture. And at the bottom we have set and setting. That's really the user state, fatigue, mindset, susceptibility, anything about the physical context, like the space, airflow, temperature, task contracts, task demands, social setting, but also postural affordance. I'll explain all of that in more detail later. The next level is more the technical level. This is really the hardcore part about, okay, can you maintain a stable frame rate, a low motion to photon latency, flawless tracking, all these kind of aspects in there. Next is really about the actual world and the interaction design in this world. So there it's really about managing optic flow, scene complexity, and so on. And then once you have the stable world, you have to move through it at some point. So how do we do this? And then the final layer is really the user agency. You can always pick how you respond to the stimuli. So very experienced VR users have really good strategies in terms of how they do this, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail. Now, one of the key underlying and unifying principle here is the idea of predictive fidelity. So really our brains are prediction engine, actually our whole system, it's not just the brain. And it really can see sickness as a result of a prediction error. So what do we mean by that? So predictive fidelity in this view is really a measure of how well a VR system allows the brain's hierarchical, precision-weighted, predictive process to function with minimal resolvable error. So the idea is there that if we use this as a framework, then it can really unify all the different theories of centric conflict, neural mismatch, postural instability, unexpected action, predictability, rest frame, DVP, all these kind of things, under this idea of one basically measure of predictive fidelity. And you've seen that we have temporal, environmental, and agential predictive fidelity that I'll explain a bit more later. And the ideas of this hierarchical model is that each layer is basically a line of defense ensuring predictions hold true. And cybersickness then basically happens if the virtual world really violates the brain's fundamental prediction about how reality should work. Now, the second key in all this is really that the comfort is shared. There's a shared responsibility of agency. So this is kind of like an inverted pyramid. So at the bottom, really, the provider, the facilitator really have the responsibility to address things, but also the user state, their mindset, huge impact. Now, and agency shifts as you move up the stack, basically. So at the bottom, responsibility is more on the developers, and at the top, agency is really almost solely with the users. The hardware manufacturers are really responsible for the technical layers, perceptual layers, whereas the developer and content creator, their agency is mostly at the layers 2, 3, maybe a bit 4, and 5 only indirectly. So Now, researchers play a special role because they typically act as a facilitator. They can train users, they provide strategies, and so on. They choose the hardware. So it's a bit unusual perspective here. But the idea is really that it should be a real partnership and almost like a handshake between the creators and the consumer, the users. Now let's begin to climb up from the very bottom. So what I'll do over the next few slides is really go through the individual layers. So let's begin and really climb this up. So at the bottom we have the layer 1. This is really the set and setting. This is kind of the foundation. So this includes the user's mindset and the physical, social, and task environment. And in a way, this is the foundation upon which everything else is built. So if that falls, then everything else is on shaky grounds. And so it's basically the essential preconditions for comfort. Let's go a bit more into detail. So it includes the mindset, so use internal state or primary predictor. So in one of our studies, a user, for example, mentioned, if I'm tired, I'm more likely to get sick. If I'm stressed or don't feel well physically, I'm more likely to get sick. So this illustrates how they're aware themselves, how much their internal mindset really has of an influence. And that's also what research clearly shows. So in general, if you're more rested, hydrated, low stress, sober, no hangover, no headaches, not overly full, not hungry, this can really help. And of course, your experience with VR, your general susceptibility to motion sickness also has a huge influence. So this is, again, at the very basic. That one is a bit hard to change, but there are some ways to habituate. And then the other big part here is the setting, the real room, the virtual task. So really creating context that can either promote comfort or induce stress. So for example, if you have a booth here or if you're a therapist using VR, anything like that, it's your responsibility really to create a good physical space, temperature not too high, not too low, decent airflow, decent fit of the system, provide a safe and open space, especially when walking. Even things like adding a bit of comfortable sound and music can help. Social setting, if somebody's overlooking you and controlling you, that's not so good. Task demands and so on. And finally, there's an element of integrating this postural stability theory. And we integrate it here in the sense of a postural affordance. So does your environment really support or challenge the user's automatic stability and balancing system? Now, some people might think like, well, maybe these setting factors aren't really that important. So I'd like to show you just one simple example also from my colleague Bernhard and collaborators, where they had a simple control condition. So over time, motion sickness rose quite a bit. But then if you add either a bit of airflow, nice smells, or comfortable music, each of them really helps to reduce motion sickness. So the takeaway of this layer is really to control whatever you can control the controllables. So for the user, really check in with your body and your mind. For the provider, facilitator, really curate a safe and comfortable space. And for the researcher, try to control and report all these variables in there. Now that we hopefully have a solid foundation, let's build on this. Let's step up the next layer in there. Oh yeah, and agency at this layer is really about preparing awareness, taking responsibility. So let's step up this ladder to layer 2, which is really the engineering bedrock of technical performance. So this is really about ensuring temporal predictive fidelity. What do we mean by that? This is really the system's ability to deliver sensor information that is intuitively predictable and consistent over time. It addresses the brain's fundamental and deeply ingrained expectation that the fabric of reality, our world, should be temporally stable and respond instantaneously to our actions. Meaning, if I move to the side and the world would sway, that's not a good sign. That will probably indicate that I'm sick or something's not going on. But this is the reality in virtual reality. And so really, this is your brain predicting that the world should be stable and responding instantaneously. And if VR doesn't accommodate this, then you have a problem. So really, technical flaws here really can shatter this prediction. Let's go a bit more into detail. So clearly the frame rate is king here. So really maintaining a high stable frame rate, ideally more than 90 Hertz depending on the simulation, avoiding any kind of shudders, dropped frames. Latency is kind of the enemy here. So really the motion to photon latency, for example, if you move your head, the system within less than 20 milliseconds should really compensate for that, because that's how fast the system is. It's actually a lot faster than that. Like our eyes automatically counter-rotate. It's deeply ingrained in our system, even with eyes closed. So really try to go down on this motion to photon latency and reduce jitter, so inconsistent latency, because that is specifically nauseating. There's additional aspects, of course, especially tracking quality is really important. So no drift, no jitter, no tracking issues, and so on. But also you have to have a fast, low persistent display to even show this and not smear out the image there. So the takeaway of this layer is really that is the bedrock of the responsibility of the content creators and hardware providers. So at this layer, Comfort is really built on engineering excellence. The user is almost entirely dependent on the system creators. So as a hardware developer, really push for low latency, high refresh rates. As a developer, optimize relentlessly and design for your target hardware performance limit. The user, well, you're a bit out of luck. You can select the hardware and you can try and adjust the graphic settings and so on, but this is typically outside of your direct control. If you're lucky, you have a bit of agency there. But again, if that layer fails, nothing we can do on top really can completely compensate for, let's say, a huge issue with latency, judder, any of these aspects. Now, that was the second layer. Now let's climb up to layer 3, which is really the heart of the developer's craft. That's the developer's toolkit. We can call it the environmental predictive fidelity. So the goal here is really to maximize this environmental predictive fidelity. What does that mean? It's really the system's ability to present a virtual world that is spatially coherent and behaves in a manner consistent with the brain's learned models of the real environment, so physics, space, object permanence, and so on. So really creating a world that is coherent, that is stable, that is predictable, and a world that behaves in a way that doesn't really violate the brain's core predictions about physical space. And one of the ways we can do this is really managing users' perceived sensation of self-motion. Who has ever experienced the idea of this dynamic viewing, dynamic field of view restriction, where basically your periphery goes in? There's one way, basically, especially in circumstances like when you're at high speed, high accelerations, to basically reduce the periphery, because it has a huge effect on your sensation of self-motion. So this looks a bit funny, but it actually does help to reduce motion sickness. Another way to do this could be to really reduce the scene complexity, take out objects, anything that creates optic flow, or even just blurring the system has been proposed. But as you can see, all of these really reduce the beautiful quality of your wonderful 3D models and reduce the field of view of your display. So you might not always want to do this. So this brings us really to a core tension in this VR design. So let's say you do VR games and you really want to maximize your user experience. For those of you who have used field of view reduction or vignettes, how many of you feel like this benefit is really worth the loss of immersion? So reducing the field of view is useful. Anybody? Yeah, if you're prone to motion sickness, if your task is to go through that, definitely. Conversely, how many of you feel like, well, this loss of immersion is too high a price of pay? I'd rather turn it off and close my eyes. It's probably also a few people. Honestly, I'm on both sides. So depending on the circumstances, what my goal is. If I want to see a beautiful, visually rendered environment, then I'd much rather close my eyes occasionally and go very slowly. But whereas if I have a task to complete, then yes, do everything so I don't get sick. Now, another really powerful strategy is to provide the brain with a stable visual anchor, like going back to the rest frame idea. So, and the idea is really to provide something that is stable. quite well known are these kind of head or vehicle-based reference frame. Here's an example of a virtual nose that you might see in there. So there's some mixed evidence whether that's really having an effect or not. What probably has a large effect is you add a cockpit or a dashboard. But here it basically moves with you. If you move your head, then this often moves with you. A cockpit and dashboard can be vehicle stable. What is more effective is typically if you provide a world-fixed reference frame. It's similar when you're on a boat. Basically, you don't want to see the cockpit of the boat. What you want to see is the stable world that actually stays stable. And in a recent study, we also explored whether utilizing pass-through can also help. So basically, when people start to get sick, maybe you can blend in a little bit of reality that's hopefully stable. Although, of course, any of these methods often tends to reduce immersion and user experience in other ways. So let's make this a bit more practical. So think of the most effective rest frame anchor that you might have used or seen in VR. And if you haven't really used any, then think of the real world. Basically, what you do if you start getting sick in a car, in a train, on a boat. And think about it, and maybe again share it quickly with your neighbor. So take another 30-second break here. So yes, you may talk. All right, thanks a lot for sharing your examples. So who has tried to look outside, basically looking for a stable environment in there? Okay, who has used a cockpit, something like that? Any other cool techniques that worked for you? Wish we would have a Discord channel, yeah. Yeah. So in a way, anything that is stable or world stable can really help. The important thing is it needs to be stable. And it ideally needs to be perceived as a background that it can be stable. So now the final set of design principles is really, in this layer, all come back to ensuring predictability and coherence. So the golden rule here is basically don't ever take camera control away from the user unexpectedly. This might be the most important practical rule. And then we can go into more detail here. So really unexpected, uncontrollable visual motion is really a primary cause of discomfort. So really prioritize user control over the camera, the virtual camera. So avoid any kind of unsolicited rotation, shakes, zooms. This looks great in a movie. But even on IMAX, it's not a good idea, and a large field of view, you will just make people sick. Reduce any kind of unnecessary accelerations, jerks, and so on. You can use smoothing functions, all of this. If needed, you can try to bring in stable UI elements, of course. And then utilize multisensory cues there as well. So even just a little bit of physical motion simulation can help a lot. Even just a little bit of vibration if you have a motion platform, great. If not, then just having consistent sound and really bringing these cues together to reduce the sensory conflict can help a lot. And as mentioned before, really ensure hardware fit. So there's enough ventilation, fit is comfortable, and so on. IPD is actually adjusted. All of this can really help a lot, make sure the lens doesn't get blurry. There's so many additional things in there. And as you see, there's a lot of different mitigation techniques. So one of the challenges in motion sickness research is also really to try and figure out, okay, how do we actually compare what is how effective? There wasn't really any decent benchmark out there. And one of the challenges is really, well, if people get seriously sick and then sickness stays and lingers, then you cannot really do a within-subject study. They might not ever come back, but we know we have huge variability between participants. So how do we do this? So this inspired us and collaborators to come up with what we call a cybersickness benchmark or VR sickness benchmark. So the idea is really, okay, can we run reliably within subject cybersickness studies that compare multiple mitigation techniques, not even on different days, but within an hour or two? And the core idea was literally inspired by a roller coaster. Who here has been on a roller coaster? Who has gotten sick on a roller coaster? A few people? Not many. So one simple thing they do is limit the time. Most roller coasters are only 1 to 2 minutes, because if you do them for 10, 15 minutes or an hour, you would get seriously sick. So inspired by that, what we created is really this very intense roller coaster where we literally used the literature to come up with the optimal way and accelerations, decelerations to make you sick maximally quickly. And that was actually quite successfully. So within a few minutes, sometimes much less than a minute, people got seriously sick. But then when we stopped the simulation, here in the blue on the plot, then also motion sickness went down quite quickly. And the cool thing is that motion sickness actually went down to pretty much 0. So we had no statistical carryover effect, meaning people recovered quickly, so they weren't super mad at us, that's good. But that also means that you can actually run another condition afterwards. So you can do it within subject design, meaning the same person, you can expose them to different conditions so they can actually compare it. It's statistically a lot more powerful. It also is a lot more doable than trying to beg them to come back after they got seriously sick. There's a lot more in there. Again, I have a link on the final slide about this. So in essence, what did you find there? So basically, the clear winner in terms of reducing motion sickness was this dynamic field of view reduction, which makes sense because if you don't see a lot of self-motion, then you don't feel self-motion, so you cannot get motion sickness if you don't really feel like you're moving. So this worked really well. The virtual nose, slightly unexpectedly, actually did seem to have a benefit in that study at least. We also tried blurring because that's supposed to work, but it actually didn't have as strong as an effect. And we tried lots of different sickness measures in here. However, the condition that worked the best, reducing the field of view, also reduced presence and immersion the most. So it's always a bit of a trade-off there between the different cues. Now, the key takeaway of this is really that layer 3 is really a partnership in comfort. So agency is really about shared control. The developers provide the tools, the users choose them. So developers' responsibility is really to implement a rich toolkit of comfort options. And the user's role or agency is really to explore, tune this, try them out. And then ideally it's this handshake between the creators and the consumers. Now, having designed a comfortable world, the third layer, now we have to move through this environment there. And this brings us to level 4, which is always about self-motion through the environment. And this is really about improving agential predictive fidelity. What do we mean by that? It's really the system's ability to make sensory feedback a predictable and proportional consequence of the user's own volitional actions and intentions. Meaning, if you control a forward movement, you should be able to predict what's going on and should be able to tap into this. Like if I make a step to the right here in virtual reality and there's even a slight offset, people don't like that too much. Same with the head movements and so on. But this is especially about self-motion here. So really ensure that the virtual self-motion is predictable and intuitive consequence of the user's own actions and intentions, whether that's a little thumbstick or like a larger movement in there. But this also brings us what I call the locomotion trilemma, basically. It's really hard to optimize all the 3 elements of comfort, user experience, low motion sickness, usability, performance, task performance, as well as presence and immersion. And there's, again, a personal preference, like, okay, what's your own priority there when you play a game? Where do you see yourself? Like for me, it's often depends on what I want to experience, what the experience is about, what is my goal in there? Do I have a purpose in there? Do you have to complete a task? Well, then it's obvious. Do you just want to play around, enjoy? Great. Do I know I have to do something important afterwards? Well, then I definitely don't want to get sick. Do I just want to be immersed in the experience? So really, this depends a lot on your goal. So let's take a look at some of the standard tools we have to work with. At the most basic level, we have the discontinuous and the continuous levels. So many of you have probably tried teleportation. It's becoming increasingly popular. Basically, let's see if this video works again. So literally, you teleport to a new orientation, location, and snap turning is the same for rotations, basically. So you snap to a new orientation. As you can see in the videos, it's nothing that would happen in the real world, so it can be a bit unexpected. So while it clearly reduces cybersickness, it can also reduce presence, naturalism, spatial orientation, and so on. Because in reality, basically, reality is continuous. And the reason this reduces cybersickness, it removes any kind of self-motion signal. So it's basically no self-motion signal. What that also means is after the teleport or after the snap rotation, basically you have to recover from this. So your system cannot predict where you're going. So there's always this moment of like, oh, I'm here now. On the other side of the extreme spectrum is continuous movement. So similar to the real world, smooth translations, turning, which are natural, so higher presence, but they can induce cybersickness, especially if they're not done well. So what can you do there? Well, of course, you can provide a well-tuned continuous locomotion system where the user control really works well, it's intuitive, maybe even providing a bit of vestibular cues in there, supporting smooth movements, limiting jerk, limiting accelerations, decelerations, allowing for physical rotations. Thank God, most of the headsets nowadays don't have a cable attached anymore, so you can actually allow them to rotate physically. This is great. This helps a lot. And if you have the space to let them walk even a little bit, that can help. Treadmill walking, the evidence isn't so clear that it actually does help, because there you have the vestibular cues missing mostly. Teleportation and snap rotation still have their place, right? So maybe that might be a good starting position as a baseline. Basically, let the choosers switch or choose and also switch back to comfort options once they start getting sick. So ideally, basically offer both and maybe start with the comfort until people know this works for them. Now let's dive a bit deeper into this trade-off. We actually wrote a paper trying to compare continuous and discontinuous methods. And I won't go into all the implications here. I just want to highlight two examples here. For example, path integration. So continuous locomotion really helps you stay oriented because you have this predictability and it taps into your automatic spatial orientation process. Again, an automatic process, great. Teleportation breaks this completely. This might not matter depending on what you'd like to do. If you have a Star Trek simulator, I mean, of course you want some kind of teleportation there, but if it's a natural simulation, maybe not. Another example is effort. So teleportation is nice, it's easy, it's free, it's effortless. However, continuous motion can create a desirable sense of accomplishment, so sometimes you might want to have this effort. So in a nutshell, what we discussed in that paper is really that what is positive, negative, what's a benefit or disadvantage really depends not just on the system, but your goals, your system goals. Do you want to achieve something? Do you want a specific user experience? What do you actually want to achieve? And this will determine what locomotion model and what user setting is really the best for you. So the right choice really depends on you and your application's goals. So let's go back to our trilemma of locomotion. Can we do better than this? Can we find new solutions that provide a better balance? And the data suggests that we can. So let's take a look at a couple of innovative approaches. Here is one of the many studies using this kind of leaning interface idea. The idea is really that by reintroducing natural physical motion cues, so leaning, so some vestibular cues, proprioceptive cues, this can really help to reduce the sensory conflict while also maintaining continuous sense of self-motion. In reality, before you're moving forward, you get a vestibular cues. You have the same system there. It's illustrated into the middle two rows. And the idea is also that maybe this can improve an intuitive, agential, predictive fidelity. So what do we find there? So the controller, the trackpad that has basically no proprioceptive cues apart from your thumbs, did indeed result in the highest sickness ratings, highest task difficulty, and highest completion times. Whereas the walking, as expected, performed best. But even through the leaning-based locomotion paradigms, even some partial body-based cues can really provide or be a cost-effective way to get closer to some of the benefits of actual walking. So it's all about benefits, but here, as you can see, the performance was already very similar to physical walking. Now, another approach is to try and combine the best of different systems, like the teleportation and continuous locomotion. We tried this in what we called the HyperJump system there. Let's see if this video works. And the idea was really to combat motion sickness by merging teleportation and continuous locomotion. And the idea is, whenever you move fast, kind of so fast that it might be nauseating, we automatically start jumping you small periods of time. So you still have a continuous sense of self-motion, but before it gets too harsh, too crazy, you start jumping. And the idea is really to combine the continuous movement benefits of predictability with teleportation. It's a pure software solution, so basically you can use it with any controller. Here we tried with hands-free, with controllers, with gamepad. We can even combine it with walking if you like, if you don't have enough space. So what we defined there. Here's a simple diagram of like, okay, did people get sick or not? And clearly with continuous locomotion, they got a lot more sick than with teleportation or either of the HyperJump systems. And same if you look at the continuous sickness rating. Basically, in the continuous locomotion, they got twice as sick, and all of the new methods actually helped. So we're almost at the level of the classic teleport. So that's quite promising, basically. And of course, there's much more work needed in there. So what's the takeaway of layer 4 here? It's really the power of choice. There is no single magic bullet that is perfect. So it's really about making an informed choice. So the developer's role is really to provide a palette of well-implemented, clearly explained locomotion choices. Whereas the user's role is really to select the methods that best balances their specific needs for comfort with their goals and the demands of the task and the desire for immersion. So again, it depends on what you'd like to achieve with the specific simulation. But it's really all about providing choice there. Now, we have almost reached that peak of our comfort stack or pyramid. So let's take a look at this peak here. The final layer is really the user's own cognitive and behavioral strategies that you can use for error correction, regulating, pacing, braking, and so on. And so let's take a look at that. And these are strategies that are completely within a user's control. They might not know this, so you might need to teach them so your experience matters. So it goes back to layer 1, basically. So the more you learn, the better your strategies become. Now, the first set of these strategies is more on the proactive side. So something you can do before the session, between the session, in a break between the session, and so on, to really set yourself up for success. And especially for new users, it can really help to choose the first VR experiences wisely. Maybe you can simple low-motion VR, minimizing intense optic flow, and so on. Maybe start with a shorter session, add rest, and then gradually increase the complexity, intensity, duration, and as your comfort level improves. So really start slow and gradually adapt. Another part is really to prepare based on your needs. And of course, you need to keep listening to what your body is telling you. So it's very clear that if you're particularly tired, stressed, hungry, hangover, any of that, that doesn't really help, right? So you will get sick a lot more easily there. And so staying hydrated, not going too hungry, and so on can really help. And of course, taking breaks. So really don't push through the system. So as soon as you start feeling any discomfort, do something about it, right? So this could be very early symptoms of nausea, disorientation, eye strain, and so on. What can you do? Well, of course, you can remove the headset, get out of VR, walk around the room, step outside, fresh air and so on can help. Drinking water can help. Some small snacks can sometimes help. Ginger is particularly useful. Even just simple things like trying to rest, steady breathing. Some people do mindful breathing and so on can help. Closing your eyes, of course, distracting you can also work. If the room is stuffy and so on, or the headset gets hot, then really adjusting the room temperature, ventilation, all of that can help. And of course, really listen to what your body's telling you to. If you're already tired, stressed, and unwell, that's not really helping. So in a nutshell, comfort is really a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not something you quickly achieve and then you stay there. It's really a skill that you build over time. It takes practice, experience. That's one of the reasons we go into detail through this. So really prepare for your session. Listen to your own body and adapt over time. Now, the second set of strategies is more reactive. So it's kind of like you're in the game, in VR, first aid kit. So what can you do without getting out of VR? Well, you can pause, you can slow down in VR as needed. Things you can do is really grounding yourself. Obviously closing your eyes, especially during provocative movements. If you know there's something fast going up, similar to a roller coaster, you can maybe briefly close your eyes. You can try to anchor your eye gaze. A few of you mentioned this already. So try to find something stable in the scene. Hopefully there is a distant horizon or something that is stable in there. And also stabilize your posture. So sitting down, leaning against something, make sure there's something real, not just a virtual table or a chair. People have tried that, doesn't work. And of course there's regulation, really controlling your breathing, slow, deep, regular breathing. This can really help a lot. And there's lots of other strategies you can do, like distracting yourself, even adding a bit of music. Anything can really help in there. A key part is also really adapt what you do, adapt your behavior. So really try to smooth your movements. If you know that this is a contributing factor, then slow it down, smooth the movement, avoid these sudden, especially unexpected movements, accelerations, jerks, and so on, and really go a lot more smoothly. And if your system, so basically the lower levels, allow you to switch locomotion mode and so on, then do this. So try switching on any of these cyber sickness mitigation tools like comfort mode. We can adapt the locomotion model. So for example, in HyperJump, we can just change the threshold when you start hyperjumping. Adding stable reference frame is something kind of that would be the equivalent to in a ship. Basically open the windows so you can see outside. So many different things you can do. But most importantly, really don't push through cyber sickness. A lot of people have tried this. It doesn't work. So for most people, you get more sick. Has anybody tried this by any chance? Does it get worse? Yeah, I've done that as well. It doesn't help. So really listen to your body, remain aware of the early cyber sickness symptom. That's one of the most important things, is really staying aware so you can recognize it early on. And when you feel discomfort, then you can actively use any of these strategies to try and reground your perceptual system, or sometimes you might have to take a break from it. Now, finally, for completeness, it's also worth noting that there's, of course, consumables, medication. Some of these can help, but really it's important to understand their trade-offs. So on the consumable non-medical side is ginger. That actually does seem to help in kind of any form. Chewing gum, staying hydrated, and then avoiding excessive alcohol, caffeine, whatever other drugs can also help to reduce your susceptibility to this. Of course, there's lots of different pharmacological examples as well. I'm not a medical professional, so talk to your GP about this, but really be important. It's kind of like if you know you have to take this ship trip, and then maybe taking medication for this one trip might work, but it's not a good solution for regular VR usage. Now, this brings us to the peak of the pyramid, and the agency is now entirely within you, the user. So you're kind of the master of your experience there. You have full control, and mastering these strategies is really the final step to a great VR experience. So the user is really at this top level of the comfort stack, is really the sole agent here. The ability to be mindful of your own strategies and deploy these strategies, use them wisely, is often the final and often most crucial line of defense against cyber sickness. And this is also something you can apply anytime. You can apply it here at Siggraph if you go into a simulation. And if you stay aware, then you can try and do this, and hopefully that helps. The developer's role is a bit more indirect here. It's really supportive. So it's really to design experiences that don't punish the user for taking a break or looking away, slowing down. So really allowing users to switch strategies and being mindful that there's a huge variability of motion sickness. So some people get sick so easily that almost any VR simulation is a problem as soon as the user starts to move. So be aware of that. So now that we've kind of climbed all the 5 layers of the VR comfort stack, in the final module, let's try and synthesize things and bring it all together, what we've learned. So let's take a look at the big picture. So maybe what I hope to give you is a few powerful, actionable ideas. Before we do this, though, let's bring it all together with a powerful mental model from safety science. That's called the Swiss cheese model. Who has actually heard of the Swiss cheese model? A few people? Okay. Yeah. Honestly, I wasn't quite aware of this until I started preparing for this talk. I was like, oh, this is actually a really good model. So the idea is there. It's borrowed from safety science, where the more tragic issues really happen when there's a failure at different levels and kind of the cheese holes line up, like in the example back there. It could be technology, process, people, whatever it is. What that means in the terms of cybersickness is really that bad cybersickness events is really single point failure. It really happens when the holes in the different layers kind of line up perfectly. So it's really a systemic failure where the latent weaknesses of the system really aligns. So let's take an example here. So here's an illustration of this Swiss cheese model in action. So let's say, imagine attendee here, Siggraph, let's call her Alex. She's running on very few hours of sleep because she's preparing a presentation and is already a bit dehydrated, over-caffeinated, the show floor is hot, noisy, so baseline resilience is already a bit lower. There's a big hole in layer 1. Next could be a hole in layer 2, technical performance. So she's trying out a very popular VR demo. Laptop is running hot, so it's starts to thermal throttle, and there's occasionally small stutters in there. Seems small, but it's a problem nevertheless. And then there might be some big holes in the layer 3 and 4, design and locomotion. So the developers, maybe they had this really cool new graphics technique that I won't even understand, but it really looks amazing. So they really wanted to disable all the comfort modes because so you can see the whole thing. And they wanted people to really experience the full thing because they're hardcore gamers themselves. So it's more aggressive, continuous joystick locomotion, fast acceleration, no vignettes. It looks really good on a screen. But in VR, that creates holes in level 3 and 4. And finally, there's a big hole in layer 4. User strategy. So Alex feels the first wave of unease, but she's a developer, she's a gamer herself, so she really doesn't want to tap out in front of the booth staff. Maybe she knows them. So she really decides to push through. And that's when kind of the whole system goes down. The different holes align, the fatigue, stuttering, aggressive motion, and the inability to listen to your own warning systems. And what's happened then? She might have to rip off the headset. We've seen this quite a few times. That's not good for her. That's not good for the providers. And this can have lasting consequences. So basically our role here is to kind of like fill in or plug in these holes in the different layers of Swiss cheese, basically, to ensure these weaknesses never align. Now, in a way, you can see this as a dual role of the layers. So the ideal is really that each of these layers is solid, you can build on top, and they support a structure. In reality, often what's happening is like there's often some kind of holes in there, so the next layer ideally can compensate for this a little bit. So it's more like an interactive defense mechanism. So ideally, there would be a perfect support structure like scaffolding, but really these layers can be more like compensating defenses. You can think of them as shock absorbers. They absorb a bit of that, but not the full thing. You still notice it, it's not ideal, and even if you have good strategies and choose different locomotion models, your user experience will likely still be a problem if you have low-level issues like latencies that are unstable worlds and things like that. So a robust system really has defenses at every level. So the idea here is really by using this VR comfort stack as a unified lens or framework. So it tries to reframe all the major theories as different types of this idea of a prediction error. So we basically don't see the different theories as competing explanations, but really simple descriptions of different types of these prediction errors that occur at different layers of this stack. So what that means is this model ideally will allow us to see how the major theories like motion, sensory conflict, postural stability, rest frames are not really competing, but descriptions of different types of prediction errors that occur at different layers of this stack in one unified frame. that's the idea so far. I have to admit, it is work in progress, this model. So it's a bit daunting to present this here, but I would love any kind of feedback you have here. Now, let's see whether we can derive some actionable recommendations from going through these different layers and going through the different stakeholders. So I have a shorter version here that I present on this slide here. So for the user, it's very clear, do check in with your setting before you start playing, before you go into VR. Master your personal strategies. This can really help if you know what to do, breaks, gaze, breathing, all kinds of things you can do. Explore all the different comfort options that the developers hopefully provided in there. If you're a developer or creator, make sure to optimize. Especially layer 2 is really your responsibility. So really provide a rich toolkit and design and locomotion options. So layer 3 and 4 is really your core responsibility. And please don't take camera control away from the user. If the user moves their head, then yes, the scene should change. If the people don't rotate their head, the scene, the world has to be stable. Now, for the providers, facilitators within you guys, do curate the physical environment. Ensure decent airflow, safety, temperature, all the kind of things we discussed here. Do guide new users with a positive framing, smart defaults, good and easy start to this. Maybe even help them with some strategies if you know they're likely to get motion sick. So this is your responsibility there. Now, if you're a platform or hardware manufacturer, really push for stable, low latency, high refresh rate of your hardware. Make sure it stays there easily and provide developers with really robust SDKs for implementing those features. Make it easy to do the right thing there. If you're a researcher, then you have a lot of different roles to play. Some of them are just like in your studies, isolate, parameterize all these values, measure and report all the confounding factors, user state, system performance, try to assess user susceptibility to motion sickness, try to go deeper and really understand what is going on, dare to do interviews and really see what strategies do they use, when does it specifically break down. You'll be amazed what you can find. And of course, share all the findings to really strengthen the ecosystem here. Now, let's come back to where we started with the whole model. So the big promise of VR and the problem of cybersickness, what I hope I have convinced you is that cybersickness is not a completely inevitable price of admission of VR. It is solvable. It's a systemic design challenge. And the better we understand this situation there, the more easily we should be able to adjust this. And the idea is here of this VR comfort stack framework and principle of predictive fidelity is to really provide a unified systemic solution to that fragmentation. So often there are so many different theories in there, and they tend to conflict, or at least some authors seem to believe that there's a huge conflict between them. I don't quite agree with that. I think they're actually different parts of this. And this idea of predictive fidelity might be one way to really bring them together and into one more coherent framework, basically. Another really important aspect is really to understand the shared responsibility. Who's responsible for what parts? So everybody has some kind of responsibility. Don't blame it on the users. Don't blame it just on the hardware developers. Don't blame it just on the content developers or the facilitators or anybody else, basically. All of them have their role to play, and only if they all align, then we can maybe kind of plug in all the holes in the Swiss cheese and make this really work. So by understanding our shared responsibility, we can climb out of that swamp of bad user experience to the summit of good user experience together. Won't be able to do it alone. I think it's really a team effort in here. So this brings me to the end. So as mentioned, here's a QR code with the website. So I did put in this course slide the notes and more resources there. And if you're interested in the VR sickness benchmark, there's an early version already out in open source. We currently basically did a complete cleanup of the code, and hopefully within the next few months, we'll have a new version of this. Feel free to reach out to me. My lab is the iSpace lab here at SFU, and yes, I am looking for students. If you know anybody who's interested in that, please send them my way. And as a little thank you and gift. I did create a preprint with more comprehensive guidelines, and they will be expanded on in a fuller paper, but I figured I should give you something here directly so you can use it directly. That's the record here as well. And in essence, here's kind of the final message I have. So I think the sensory conflict really tells us what is happening in cybersickness. But the idea of our framework really aims to explain the underlying why. So it is fundamentally a prediction error problem with the VR comfort stack. Hopefully allows us to tackle more systematically. So thanks a lot for your attention, for being here, for engaging in this beautiful Sunday afternoon. And yeah, I think we actually have quite some time for questions. And I'll also be around here after the session if you want to talk some more. So thanks a lot.